All right. Welcome, Professor Doak, to the conversation today. We're going to be discussing a little bit about Japanese nationalism, Japanese traditional culture, and Catholicism. By way of introduction here, if you don't mind, I'm just going to plagiarize and read straight from a biography I found online here, just to give listeners a sense of your work. Professor Kevin M. Doak is Nippon Foundation Endowed Chair, Professor of Japanese Studies, and Chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Georgetown University. The winner of the first Terada Mari Japan Study Award, he specializes in the study of nationalism and democratic thought and culture in modern Japan, as well as in the literary, cultural, and philosophical expressions of public thought and values. Recently, he has served as co-editor of the Journal of Japanese Studies and on the executive board of the Society for Japanese Studies. His writings in Japanese have been prominently published in major Japanese newspapers and journals, and cited by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in his book Atarashi Kuni, published 2013, excuse me. Professor Doak's current research focuses on issues related to politics and religion, especially Catholicism, in modern Japan, covering jurisprudence, fiction, literary works, and theology. His most recent book is Tanaka Kotaro and World Law, Rethinking the Natural Law Outside the West. So without further ado, Professor Doak, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And just one quick correction, I feel obligated. I am no longer the chair of my department. Everything else you said is more or less true, but we've passed that on.
That's probably a relief, right?
Oh, a big relief. Absolutely. Glad to have that behind me. Yeah.
Very good. Well, can we start off by, you've got that beautiful background there of the artistic rendition. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the scene?
Sure. This is part of a genre called Namban art, or Namban pictures. Namban means Southern barbarians. And that was the term the Japanese used for the Jesuits, the actual Iberians, not just the Jesuits, but the Spaniards and Portuguese who came to Japan, because they came from a southern route. We would say, why not Westerners? So they were from a southern route, and they were called Southern barbarians. And this is a piece of depiction pretty much contemporaneous with that time period. There's several of these. And it gives us a sense of how the Japanese saw the arrival of these Europeans who arrived in Japan in the mid-16th century. So I just thought it was kind of interesting. And you can see in the background, there's a little temple that's been converted into a church. So you can see this kind of syncretism at the time out of necessity. And I thought it'd make a nice backdrop for our conversations.
Beautiful. Well, thanks for bringing that into the conversation today. I thought we'd start out by way of topics, kind of wade in and go deeper as we go. Your research has been a lot on, as you mentioned, Japanese nationalism. So just from my vantage point, as someone who's not an expert, you'll see headlines now and then about a politician who maybe ruffles some feathers by visiting, national Shinto shrine for the commemoration of war dead. Overtures towards modifying the Constitution, especially in the area of armament and militarism. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the general goals of Japanese nationalism, and what's the background conversation there that you don't really get if you're just looking at headlines?
Right. It's a complicated problem for sure. Let me try to be a little simplistic, hopefully not too reductive. I think the person who's been in the headlines the most is former Prime Minister Abe, Shinzo Abe, who was the longest serving Japanese prime minister. And he did go to Yasukuni once and got a lot of criticism for it. China and other countries in the region really created a lot of backlash to that. And he didn't feel comfortable going again. But when he did go, he pointed out that there's a sub shrine at Yasukuni Shrine that's for people who died from other countries. So Yasukuni is not just about Japan's dead. It really is a spiritual, if not religious place for people to confront the reality that people die for their country and what does that mean for us today? What do we owe them? And so Abe, I think, is a leader in this effort to rethink the post-war regime. In fact, he calls it the need to escape from the post-war regime. And for many people, Abe and his circle and many others, the post-war regime is really a way of keeping Japan weak and de facto today allowing communist China and others in the region to become strong. And they feel that Japan should be allowed to be a autonomous, what they call natural or healthy nation, just like any other nation. So they want to remove some of the artificial restrictions placed on Japan's self-defense capacities, which Abe did somewhat by developing stronger security ties with the United States, but there's still a long ways to go. And so if you think about what Japanese nationalism really is, I would say, first of all, it's not a threat to America. It's not a threat to democracies. In fact, we should encourage more of it, because what they're really trying to do is become a real full partner in a global arrangement of liberal democracies. This is what Abe called, it's an awkward translation, but it's an awkward word in Japanese, globist diplomacy. This was his agenda, his vision, not globalism, but rather looking at the whole world and saying, just because we're in East Asia doesn't mean our allies have to be nearby. Our allies can be anybody around the globe who share our values. So it's very interesting, and it's a very important point, that Japanese nationalists tend to be democratic people. They tend to be people who respect individual rights, and they simply are saying nationalism and individualism, nationalism and globalism are not necessarily contradictory forces, and they want to right that imbalance that's come from the post-war regime.
Thanks. That's really interesting. So it does strike me, I guess, in a sense, like Germany, Japan had a situation of, after the war, I mean, it's essentially an American imposed constitutional regime, right? I mean, I don't want to be blunt here, but
Yes.
that's
Yes.
what was going on. And at a certain point, to be a full, not just a junior partner, but an equal player at the table. I mean, you have to have a certain autonomy, right, to guide your internal life and your place in the world.
Yes, and the tensions are even more so with Japan, I think, than perhaps Germany, that while they want to escape from a post-war regime that was imposed upon them by the Americans, they really love the Americans. So public opinion surveys show the Japanese are our best friends. They rate America higher than any other nation, and of all nations rating America highly, the Japanese people have the highest rating. So it's not personal. They're not saying we want to remove ourselves from American influences so that we can counter American influences at all. It's we need to be able to act with dignity and self-respect. We need to overcome the legacies of 70 years ago so that we can help America stem the tide of illiberal, undemocratic, in fact, even totalitarian forces, some of which are very near Japan. And I think that's really what they're trying to do.
Interesting. Could you say a little bit, what are some of the other dimensions to this concept of, escape from the post-war regime? I came across a couple weeks ago a book called Kindai no Kyomo, which I think translates to the falsehood of the modern age, something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I love that title, but I don't know kind of what the author expressed, because my Japanese is nowhere near at the level of reading it. So what are some of these aspects of the post-war regime and maybe the falsehood of the modern age that Japanese figures maybe think need to be moved past?
I think we have to approach those issues separately. So there has been almost 100 years or more in Japan an intellectual discourse on overcoming modernity. Right at the heart of World War II, they had a symposium called that, Overcoming Modernity. I believe it was 1942. And that was a very broad question. It wasn't simply rejecting the West, although that could become parts of it. One of the participants in this 1942 symposium on overcoming modernity is a guy that I'm studying now, Japan's leading Catholic theologian, Yoshimitsu. And he said, yes, we have to overcome modernity because modernity is the period where man lost sight of God. All right? Now, that's very different from the post-war regime. People like former Prime Minister Abe, who have said Japan needs to escape from the post-war regime, aren't necessarily trying to overcome modernity. They're trying to say, let's get back on the track of modernity. If modernity meant that every people should have their own independent nation, and in Japan it's constitutional democratic, that's what we want to get back to. But the American occupation imposed artificial constraints on that process, and we want to remove them so that we can go back to being an autonomous, modern, democratic nation state. So they're kind of intertwined, but they're separate, distinguishable issues.
Yeah. I mean, is there any sense in which, when I think about Americanization, I guess the instinct is to, modernization in opposition to tradition. I guess that's kind of the unspoken assumption that I'm operating on there, perhaps incorrectly. Is that, yes, it sounds like you'd push back on that in the context of Japan in the last 70 years.
Well, if you even want to go back further. So this is one of the key distinctions from Japan and other non-Western societies that go through the process of modernization. People often contrast Japan with China. You could also include India in this. In the 19th century, Japan successfully modernized, and it really got everybody's attention. So that by the end of the century, they were able to defeat Russia, right, a European power, in the Russo-Japanese War, and clearly defeated China 10 years before that, before the 19th century was out. And people say, how did they do that? And they didn't do it by saying, we're going to reject modernity and go back to our traditional stuff, eating raw fish, wearing only kimonos, and using swords. They said, we're going to modernize, and we're going to modernize in a way that's going to retain something very important from our tradition, which was the imperial system. So prior to, say, 1868, when this modern revolution happened, Japan had another modernity. One might call it the Leviathan modernity. The Tokugawa regime came in for 300 years and constructed, historians will debate this, but you could say in certain ways, constructed an authoritarian, totalitarian state that kept the emperor marginal, almost invisible. And so by the mid-19th century, people who wanted to restore the tradition centered on the emperor overthrew that totalitarian regime based on Confucian Chineseness and ushered in the Meiji Restoration. Very important, they call it the Meiji Restoration, right? So they moved forward by going backwards. Now, no sooner had they done that when they realized that they had to stop persecuting Catholics. So right at the edge of this revolution, they threw about 3,000 Japanese Catholics in concentration camps. And they said, we're going to have Shinto only. They also persecuted Buddhists, but Catholic persecution was the most vicious. Then when they go around the world to try to get Western countries to cooperate in helping them modernize, the Western powers, including US President Grant, said, no way, not until you release these Catholics that you have in your concentration camps, stop torturing them, and make sure you offer secure religious freedom to all your people. Well, the Japanese weren't stupid, and they immediately said, got to do it, we got to do it. So they kicked out the Shinto radicalists, and they became a modern kind of pluralistic state, and religious freedom prevailed from before the end of the 19th century. So this was an alternative way to become modern and at the same time retain the imperial system, which was the essence of tradition, and yet modernize the imperial system. Let me give you one rather shocking example of how they modernized the imperial system. The current emperor and empress of Japan, the Reiwa emperor, were both baptized Catholics. This is supposed to shock people because the Japanese media have kept this completely quiet. I don't think it's been in print anywhere, but I've done research and I can guarantee you a 95% chance that both the current emperor and empress were baptized. Now, does that mean they practice the faith? I would say they're probably a lot more like European Catholics of their generation. I don't know, but they don't seem to be as overt about it as the emperor's mother was. The empress mother, the Empress Emeritus Michiko, was a well-known Catholic. Although she couldn't practice her faith openly because of the restrictions of her position, she was close to many Catholic priests, bishops, and even cardinals, had them visit the house. That's not really contestable. So here's how you maintain the imperial system. You don't see it in opposition to global values. And so the imperial system in Japan, the monarchs, are some of the most global people in the world, and the Japanese people love them. Except for the communists in Japan. They do have a communist party, and they hate the monarchy.
Well, that's fascinating. There's a lot to unpack here. So when you referred to this, I guess Leviathan aspect,
Yeah.
that's referring to the Meiji Restoration.
Before.
That's
so,
referring to the Tokugawa state.
The Tokugawa, 1600 to 1868. There was the Bakufu. Yeah.
And that you described as Leviathan for the reasons that it had kind of suppressed this ongoing tradition of the emperor's centrality.
The main reason I describe as the Leviathan is because what the Tokugawa did over time was construct a very oppressive regime in which there was very little freedom for anybody. Very little freedom. Historians contest this and they're trying to defend it. But the fact of the matter is they based everything on the suppression of Catholics. So at the beginning of that regime, Catholicism was booming. We don't know how many, 300,000, 1 million, some estimates. And at one point, the Tokugawa decided that this wasn't good for their own political control because there were a lot of Catholic daimyo, Catholic princes that had tens of thousands of Catholic samurai. And so they said, we got to get rid of this Catholic influence because it may threaten us. Tokugawa himself was a devout Buddhist. So what he did was, after rigorously persecuting, martyring Catholics, both foreign and Japanese, By 1640, he shut down the system and he put up signs in every village. If you run into anybody who practices the evil cult, turn them in and you'll be paid so many pieces of silver, more for a priest than for a layperson. These signs stayed up till 1872, I think it was, until after US Grant told them you got to stop persecuting the Catholics. So this whole period, there was about 50,000 Catholics underground in Japan. Well, we know that because in 1865, when they resurfaced, we knew there were 50,000. So how many there were over those centuries, we don't know. So this was a period of terror. If you were a Catholic, or if you were in any ways heterogeneous in your thinking, if you didn't necessarily support the way the Tokugawa regime ruled, you were in trouble. And of course, the penalty for all crimes was execution, if not tortured execution. So in that sense, I think you can call it a Leviathan.
Okay, very, very cool, very interesting. So it sounds like part of what you're saying is that the emperor is kind of a locus of revived traditional Japanese culture in that retelling.
Yeah.
So
you
what?
Know, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
So Bishop Robert Barron, quite famous in Catholic public discourse circles, very famously said, in any society, there's something that's the center of power and authority and culture and identity. Find out what it is. And he says it'll almost always be inimical to Christianity. Well, in Japan, there's no question that the center of power and authority is the imperial system. It's been in power as long, pretty much as Rome has, right? 2,000 years of continuous lineage. But I'm suggesting it's not necessarily antithetical to Christianity today. What was antithetical to Christianity was this Bakufu system built on Chinese Confucian ideology that tried to suppress the imperial system and for their own self-preservation rigorously persecuted Christianity. The imperial system really hasn't at all. I would say today they're very close to Christian values. But that is definitely the center of tradition. It's just been very global and very modernizing, even as it maintains that core consistency.
Very interesting. So what, take me a little deeper then into kind of traditional Japanese culture. I mean, obviously the emperor is an important locus of it, but when we think of Japan, we think of Tokyo. I mean, it's a huge, modern city. Where is the tradition and who are its cultivators to this day?
Right. So what I was saying at the outset, I just want to go back to Japan did a remarkable job of avoiding the binary opposition between tradition and modernity. That's what they did in the 19th century with the Meiji Restoration. They were able to blend them successfully so that tradition and modernity do not lie as bipolar opposites. So you go to Tokyo and many Westerners think, oh, it's going to be all electronics and modern stuff and crazy stuff. And you turn the corner and there's a quiet little temple or a quiet little garden or a quiet little cathedral, right? And you can go in there. In fact, one of the landmarks in downtown Tokyo is the Nikolai Orthodox Church. Everybody knows about it, not just Christians. So it's this amazing blending of tradition, of quiet, of energy, of modernity. I suppose the easy and the cheap answer that I'm avoiding is Kyoto. The ancient capital is supposed to be the antipode to Tokyo. Well, I took a sabbatical in Kyoto and I lived there for a year and I love the city, but it's modern, trust me. It's as modern, maybe more modern than Tokyo, because the people who live in Kyoto don't want to be left out. So the universities, the coffee shops, the restaurants, very Western, very modern, very French actually. But a lot of people want to see Kyoto as a kind of museum of tradition. So outlying Kyoto on the outskirts are all of these restored old villas and gardens that evoke the kind of tradition that Westerners want in Japan, and some Japanese want. But for the most part, after the post-war begins, after 1950s and 60s, there's not really a strong super traditionalism that wants to reject modernity in Japan. There was in the pre-war period, but these people have been largely marginalized and erased. There's still a few around, but I would say the traditionalists, the people who support tradition in Japan, are people like former Prime Minister Abe. They're very modern, they're very democratic, and they're just saying, we want to be able to say, if we can have green tea and sushi, we can have green tea and sushi, okay? But maybe tomorrow I want to have beefsteak and red wine, but don't take away my green tea and sushi.
Right, yeah.
They want to have all of that.
Interesting. So okay. So it sounds then like we're really dealing with a different paradigm here. It's important not to think of a sort of because in the West we've obviously got this very strong sense of progressivism, which wants to roll back the idea of this kind of Christian heritage, the Greco-Roman sort of patrimony, but that's just not got to leave that thinking at the door, leave that behind when you're thinking about Japan's dynamics.
Overall, yes. I've been trying to portray what I call the mainstream of Japanese society. And the mainstream of Japanese society, I had a friend here in DC from Japan tell me, goes like this. A conservative in America would be considered liberal in Japan. In other words, society is far more conservative than American society is. And the second part of that is, to your point about where are the progressives, Japan does have a communist party in the Diet. It's very small, but unlike America, they have an organized Japanese Communist Party. They also have a Japanese Socialist Party. There are socialists and communists in Japan, and they don't like the imperial system. So back to Bishop Barron, it's not just that we can say the Catholics or the Christians should be opposed to the emperor, and some are. They shouldn't be, but some are. But it's also the communists who don't like Christians and they don't like the imperial system. And I think the communists are the ones who really don't want the imperial system. They want, in fact, the emperor to be tried as a war criminal. They want him to be executed. They want him to be killed. But most Japanese don't. Most Japanese are very traditional, very conservative, and very modern. And that's what makes it such a fascinating place.
So what in practice, when you look at I guess you'd call the left, or communist and social, what's kind of their agenda today in Japan? What are kind of the practical and active moves? What are the aspirations? I mean, you hinted at it just now, but
yeah, they're very strategic because they're not very popular, and so they try to work with other parties. But I think fundamentally, when they're honest, what the communists and maybe some of the extreme socialists really want is Japan to sever its ties with America and become closer to communist China. And they're trying to carry that out through education policies, through unionization, through various other policies as well. And they tend to be, of course, very anti-Christian, which means that the mainstream political parties tend to be kind of favoring Christianity because they see this as a way of a counterweight against the communists who want to drag Japan into a closer alliance with communist China.
Interesting. So we're, coming back to the beautiful illustration behind you with the church in traditional kind of Japanese style there. Where does the Catholic Church fit into these questions of, with its place within Japanese society, its place in relation to the Japanese tradition?
So the first question is, by the church, do you mean the people or the hierarchy?
Let's go however you want to answer it.
All right. I got to give you two different answers. And obviously there are overlaps. There are people who support the hierarchy's position. I'll be quite honest with you. Sadly, from my perspective, the Conference of Japanese Catholic Bishops has come out with a very left-wing position that almost at times seems interwoven with the Socialist Party, if not the Communist Party even. They're very pacifist. They're very anti-Shinto. They think that the emperor shouldn't go anywhere near Yasukuni Shrine. They even sometimes speak in hyperbolic terms about a fear of religious freedom in Japan, which I find ludicrous. I think I have more religious freedom in Japan as a Catholic than I do in America. So I don't know what they're talking about, really. But there's a kind of overreaction to World War II by many of them, whether it's on grounds of pacifism or whether it's on Yasukuni, or whether it's people like Abe who want the military to be stronger to counter-effect communist China. That's the hierarchy. At the same time, the hierarchy is struck in a very difficult tension between globalization and nationalism. Because what they're trying to do originally was move away from what they called a Hellenistic Catholic Church. They wanted to be part of the de-Hellenistic movement, getting rid of Greek and Latin influences. It's very hard to find a Latin mass in Japan. At one point, I think they were allowing it once a year. I'm not even sure now, after the new motu proprio from Pope Francis, they're going to even do that, right? So they're very much against what they call the Latin Church. One of the things they've done recently, in the last couple of years, is they removed all the kneelers in church so that you cannot kneel during the Eucharistic prayer. And the reason they gave for that was kneeling is a Western European thing. This is what knights in the Middle Ages did. Well, of course, it's absurd on its face because everybody who knows anything about Japan knows that when they show respect, they get down on the ground and they bow and they kneel, right? on all fours sometimes. But that's what they're doing in the name of nationalizing the church, making it more Japanesey. All right. Now, the problem they're having, and by the way, I think some of that nationalization of the church, they're drawing from contemporary works in Germany, where there's this, and I don't mean just the recent movement in Germany, but going back to the 70s, an effort to define a more German church versus the Roman church. And now we're seeing where that's led in terms of a potential schism. So while they're trying to nationalize and make the church more Japanesey, get rid of Latin hymns, everything in the Japanese, what? They've got so many immigrants who've come in that some estimates, I think they're high, but some estimates say there's an equal number of non-Japanese Catholics now in the Catholic Church in Japan than there are Japanese Catholics. So this has driven globalization. Right? We need to have more masses in English and 50 other languages. And we need to be open to different non-Japanese ways of doing things. And of course, the tensions between this globalization reality of all these immigrants and the nationalization where they wanted to have a more Japanese faith have not been reconciled. And I don't know how they're going to reconcile. And that's one of the key tensions that we still see in the church in Japan today, in terms of the rule and the governance and the hierarchy.
And is part of this just a fruit of the Japanese hierarchy? Maybe they, in their formation to become, bishops over time, they're in heavy contact with, I guess, German, as you said, and other kind of Western theological sources that over time kind of shape that effect.
Yeah. And I think the reason for Germany goes all the way back to the post-war period, where both the German church, which I know much less about, but certainly the Japanese church, are reflecting on World War II. Why didn't we stop the war? What could we have done? All war is bad. There is no such thing as a just war. Look at what happened. Their cities, just like the German cities, were all bombed. It's not just Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in the early post-war and well through Vatican II, many of the bishops and priests experienced this war, and they came out very strongly as though the only moral issue of relevance is war. And the conservatives, the nasty conservatives, are at fault for that. And so they had a very much left-leaning tendency. I think they still do.
So help explain to me though, so the de-Hellenizing of the church and the making it, I guess, more Japanese, wouldn't it seem that a more global view is to be more Latinate and more Hellenistic than sort of nationalist and Japanese?
Right, of course. That's why I say those tensions are still there. I mean, you cannot, it's the same problem we have around the world. You cannot offer the Mass in enough languages that you'll cover everybody who doesn't understand the local language. And if we just did the Mass in Latin, people could adjust. I speak from experience. When I was in Holland on a research trip and I would go to Mass, I don't know any Dutch. And there's very few parts of the Mass that were in Greek or Roman or Greek or Latin I could join in on, right? And the same thing for these immigrants who are coming from other parts of the world. In Japan, they can't learn the Japanese language, but they've been exposed somewhere here and there to Latin. So yes, that would be a logical solution, but they just don't want to do that. And I think it's for political reasons as much.
And then you said you were going to, there's the bishops, right, and then I guess by implication the faithful. So what's the other side of the coin there?
So this is where it gets very interesting. There's a number of very prominent Japanese Catholics who are very conservative. And while they don't like to come out and say anything about the bishops, remember, it's a very small church, very small community, about 400,000. So in a sense, especially in Tokyo, everybody pretty much knows everybody. So they don't say anything explicitly against them, but let me give you a couple examples. There's a member of parliament, woman, named Yamatani Eriko, very senior member of the ruling party. And I'm told, I can't verify this, I'm told that she has no problem visiting Yasukuni Shrine. Another one that I do know personally is the Catholic author, another woman, who also ran a very important NGO, the Nippon Foundation, and her name is Sono Ayako. And I've translated one of her novels. And she told me that she visits Yasukuni. And I said, why do you visit Yasukuni? And she says, you got to remember, I was a teenager when the war ended. Some of my friends went off and died, and I promised them that I would go to Yasukuni and pray for them. Now, obviously, these Catholic women and other Catholics who go to Yasukuni don't go there and do a Shinto ritual. They go there and quietly probably say a Hail Mary or an Our Father. Because the interesting thing about this shrine is nobody requires you to do anything. You're not required to read a Shinto prayer or praise the Shinto gods. You can stand there and do nothing or whatever you want. And so we do have a number of Catholic conservatives. Unfortunately, one died just a few years ago. Watanabe Shoichi was one of the leading cultural critics very conservative man, and very openly Catholic man. So we do have still to some degree, a lot of elderly Catholics in particular who are very conservative, and they just more or less ignore the bishops. And they just continue on writing very conservative things, contributing to the conservative culture in Japan from a distinctively Catholic perspective.
Very interesting. So going back here for a minute to kind of the situation as you described with the bishops, and it sounds like what you're kind of describing there is a little bit of faddish appropriation of enculturation, right, as a concept there. Though I'd like to think, just based on the great stuff I've read by folks like Pope Benedict in the past on he has brilliant stuff on the idea of enculturation and of the faith sort of fulfilling and perfecting that which is found in the culture. So are there areas in which maybe this work has happened in a more organic and appropriate way of the faith and the Japanese tradition kind of finding? I mean, obviously behind you is a perfect example in a sense, right? But how is that continued now, especially in the present?
Right. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. One of the most exciting things going on in the field of Catholic studies in Japan is a group of, I want to say younger, but now I'd have to say middle-aged, but people in their probably 40s, 50s, maybe early 60s, scholars who are going back and looking at Japanese Catholic intellectuals and the Catholic discourse in the pre-war period, right? Before Vatican II, back when, as you say, the Mass was all in Latin in Japan. And they're finding a number of these people very important, priests and lay people, and they're publishing them and republishing their works. And they're really helping contribute to a sense that what was going on in the pre-war period in Catholicism in Japan was very much what Pope Benedict wrote about. And I think that can be used as a nice lens within which to look at the relations between Japanese culture and Catholicism. As I recall it, he says we should talk about interculturality, not inculturation, where you take the faith and pour it into a culture. Because as he points out, faiths already come cultured. Faiths are answers to fundamental human questions. So in a sense, you could say a faith is a culture. So what happened in this picture behind me is the Japanese have been asking questions before the Iberians arrived, before the Jesuits arrived. Who am I? Is there life after death? Is there a God? And they were coming up with half answers, answers that were contradictory, gods that were human, that weren't really gods. And they weren't really clear on what happens. So the Iberians and the Jesuits come and they say, here's an answer to that question. Francis Xavier is extraordinarily good. By the way, he was the smartest guy of his generation in Europe, right? I'm not just making that up. He was at the top of his class at the University of Paris. That makes you the smartest guy in Europe of your generation, right? He could have been a professor anywhere. He could have been the top bishop or cardinal in Europe. And he goes to Japan and he engages with the Buddhists and the other people about these ideas. And within 50 years, there's got to be at least 300,000 converts. Some numbers go higher than 600,000, even up to 1 million, but most historians say 200 to 300,000. You know why that's interesting? I just discovered this. I think today we had the feast day of, Pope Cornelius?
Yep, and yeah. Cyprian, I think, right?
Cyprian and the Pope, right? Pope Cornelius. So I just found out that when he was the Pope, which was after 250 years of evangelizing in Rome, which has so many commonalities that 2 at least of the apostles were in Rome. You know how many Catholics they got in 250 years of proselytizing? 50,000. Francis Xavier really outdid him. Okay, we're talking about a nation versus a city, but for comparative purposes, a city that was historically and culturally linked to the Holy Land, to the languages there, and they got only 50,000 in 250 years, and Francis Xavier got well over 300,000 in 50 years. I mean, not just him, but he and his successors. So the answers that the Jesuits brought to Japan resonated with them. Like, these are good answers, and the culture changed. How did the culture change? Many people have heard of the food tempura, fried vegetables. That was based on the Latin word for the time when you couldn't eat meat, the tempora, when you couldn't eat meat. And we know that the Jesuits brought that because the Japanese didn't deep fry anything. They brought that with them from China, where people deep fry. Okay? And they brought in new words like kappa for a cape, which is still in the Japanese vocabulary today. They changed the vocabulary, they changed the culinary culture, they changed so much. They changed the architecture of castles, for example, when they brought in guns. But in other words, the culture changed. And I think this is Pope Benedict's key point that we should remember when we think of Japan. Cultures are not static. The big mistake that many people in India and China made when confronted with modernization was to adopt a defensive posture to protect something they thought was static. The Japanese knew cultures were historical and evolving, and so they guided that process of development so that they maintained their tradition even as they modernized it. It's one of the things that makes Japan so fascinating.
Very interesting. And so that it seems that that's pretty unique, right? If you were to take that as a case study,
So.
and very interesting. So, oh yeah, so that's very good and that's very interesting. One question I have here in relation to that, you have sort of things like the Black Legend, let's say, in the West, which in many ways
Yeah.
continue to circulate. Obviously, I would guess that in Tokugawa times, when that great progress that you described of 300,000 baptized was kind of suppressed and sort of severely cut down, there must have been stories and narratives that circulated about the Iberians, as you say, and the Catholics more broadly. How has some of that stuff trickled down today? I mean, obviously, it's still a very small minority, and so there must be wider impressions in Japan of what Catholics do and who they are. Maybe you address this. I know you've got that book about the legacy of Francis Xavier today.
Right. I'm glad you put it that way, because in Xavier's legacies, I wanted to talk about the modern period. And actually, the modern period, meaning late 19th century, was a period when you got a lot more of those equivalents to the Black Legend going. And it wasn't just about Christianity. There were people who were opposed to modernization, and they were convinced that the telegraph lines that they were starting to put up operated on the blood of young children, stuff like that. They were convinced that these Christians, when they talked about the Mass, they were actually going to take your kids and drink their blood. And they talked about cannibalism. That really flourished more in the late 19th century with Catholics and Protestants in Japan. And it wasn't so much only religious as it was a great anxiety that what happened in Qing China might happen in Japan. It didn't, but in those periods of anxiety, there was a lot of anti-Westernism, assassinations, murders, all kinds of violence. But if you go back to the time period behind me, there was very little of that. Some very marginal historians today, once in a while, you'll hear somebody murmur about the Jesuits and the slave trade because they want to kind of smear them. Actually, the Jesuits were not involved in the slave trade. Yes, some Portuguese were involved in the slave trade, but for the most part, the Japanese really don't see it that way. They're very grateful for what went on the screen behind me. They're very grateful for what happened, because in many ways, what happened when Westernization came, and Christianity in particular, is that it gave the Japanese some tools to use to differentiate them from their neighbors. And as they look around today, they're saying, wow, we really don't want to be like communist China. And why aren't we? Well, some of that credit, at least, has to go to the fact that we were open to Westernization. We were open to Christianity. Even if not all of us became Christian, we let them build schools. And particularly in the modern period, it's amazing how many Japanese have gone to a Christian school. There's Christian schools all over Japan. And if those Christian schools had to be a majority Christian, they wouldn't be able to fill the slots. There's only a couple percentage of the population are Christian, but there's Christian schools everywhere. So many Japanese people are very comfortable with Christianity, even though they don't necessarily believe it. They respect it.
Interesting. Now, so, obviously when the Jesuits were coming in, an aspect of what they were encountering, as you expressed some of these, partial answers to existential questions, was obviously a big influence of the Confucian tradition, in Japan's, is my understanding, in addition to native sources. So what can you tell me about, and again, maybe this is a Western concept, but a sort of Japanese canon? If someone really wants to dig into sort of Japanese tradition and this idea, a concept of great works, formative works, and ideas. Right. What are the contours of that deposit, I suppose?
Let me give you two apparently contradictory answers to that question. The best answer is there isn't a canon, because Japan's native religion, and one of the things I'm fascinated with, is paganism. And by paganism, no, I do not mean anything derogatory. This is the term for what all of us believed in before monotheism replaced it. Whether you were in Greece or Ireland or Scandinavia or Rome, these pagan religions were just kind of tribal beliefs in a divinity around you. And they're gone now, almost everywhere in the world. Neo-paganism is not real paganism. In Japan, it was able to remain, and largely because it doesn't have a canon, a scripture, and it doesn't have an authoritative magisterium. so it can blend and be all things to all people as history changes. That may be one of the reasons that it's so hard to proselytize in Japan, because you're not sure what you're aiming at. It's constantly in flux. Now, the contradictory answer is, yes, there are a couple texts that people look to, old texts, maybe around, what was it, 8th century or earlier, the Kojiki, record of ancient things, or the Nihon Shoki. These are, again, compendiums of local legends with all kinds of names of gods in them that are open to all kinds of interpretations. And then later, a couple hundred years later, comes along the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji, which is a fascinating story of romance that has no particular order to it. It can be read in any order you want. It's not like a narrative that develops. Pick up any chapter, it doesn't matter. Those would be the three main texts that people turn to and have turned to at least through the 18th, 19th centuries to try to define a tradition. But today, nobody reads them. Nobody reads them. Nobody cares about them. The canon in Japan is basically the canon in America. So what they learn in the universities and what intellectuals talk about is Augustine, Aquinas, Hegel, Kant, Marx, Darwin. I mean, that's the way they think and that's the way they talk. And most Japanese intellectuals probably have never read these ancient texts.
Okay. Interesting. So take us to some of the, you mentioned the conversations going on today, people discussing Hegel and so forth. Take us to some of those Japanese thinkers that are having, I guess, some of these cutting edge, conversations on society, sort of debates in the public square. You point out Tanaka Kotaro as an important legal contribution. I noticed your other book, Dreams of Difference, on the Japanese Romantic School and the Crisis of Modernity. What are some of those conversations that are going on, both now and within the past couple generations?
So the reason that
where's
both
the
of those
action?
books,
I think that's what I'm asking you. Where's the action?
Once more?
Where's the intellectual action today in Japan? I think that's what I'm asking.
It ain't. That's the easy answer. Both of those books that you talk about are about intellectuals that were most influential in the 1930s. And that says a lot. Now, Tanaka, who was very influential in the 1930s, continued to be influential in the 40s and 50s. Then he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he wasn't able to publish as widely on big issues. And that was pretty much the end of it. Then he peters out as a justice at The Hague. But that was still an era when they had real Japanese intellectuals, and that's why I was drawn to writing about them. And I'm currently writing about a Japanese theologian who died in 1945, right? Did his work in the 30s. I'm sorry to say that there aren't very really wide-ranging Japanese intellectuals, public intellectuals, that are speaking to broad issues that would be compelling to people outside Japan. Most of the issues that are animating Japanese intellectual discourse are about politics, about economics, and about even more highly technical issues. It's just a sad reality. So if I were to pick somebody that I think is a representative of one of the leading Japanese, particularly public intellectuals, it's another woman. I know I brought up a lot of women today, but her name is Yoshiko Sakurai, or in Japanese, Sakura Yoshiko. Sakura Yoshiko, fascinating woman, very conservative, but she has, I think, at least a master's degree from the University of Hawaii. She's fluent in English. She was a national journalist, very famous journalist in Japan, and started writing books about Japan's crisis and about what's going on in our society. And now she heads the most influential think tank in Japan, the Japan Institute of National Fundamentals. And there's hundreds of people affiliated with it, most of them who are very influential, high-level politicians in the governing party. She publishes online as well as has a TV show that she runs out of her house. Very, very influential woman. And I think if I can boil it down, because it's not a high abstract level of discussion, her main concern is we got to be careful that we don't sell our country out to China. If we want to protect freedom, if we want to keep ourselves Japanese and all the good things that come from our tradition, we really have to be on watch because China is coming after us and we can't defend ourselves. Because on the one hand, our hands are tied with the Americans saying you can't really have full military capabilities. I'm not even sure she wants nuclear. Nobody in Japan wants nuclear. You can't have a full military capability, and yet at the same time, China is constantly encroaching and North Korea is shooting missiles over us, and they have a nuclear power now. So that's probably the most important influential public intellectual in Japan today. They're not the kind of philosophical things that maybe we're used to, but they're focusing on the things that are vital to them.
So if we were to point out, crisis has been brought up a couple of times in the conversation. Is geopolitical neighbors maybe the sort of foremost issue, would you say, in public consciousness?
Well, I think there's two levels to that, particularly for somebody like Sakurai Yoshiko. Geopolitical is the external threat, but the crisis is that, and this goes back to something I mentioned about former Prime Minister Abe, the crisis is that the Japanese post-war regime is not functioning in a healthy way. So Japanese people are becoming increasingly disillusioned with a government that doesn't seem responsive to their needs. It seems much more interested in global economics than in taking care of their own people. One example that comes up with Abe, but also to a certain degree with Sakurai, is the Japanese citizens who were kidnapped and hauled away to North Korea. And when they bring that issue up in America, among their allies, and say, America, we need your help, the Americans have basically said, that's a minor issue. We're dealing with denuclearization. We can't deal with that. And like, well, then why is our government not able to protect its own people? Right? We saw something of that recently with Afghanistan. So for them, the question is the state responding to the people, or is the state one of these global institutions that is increasingly separated from the people and their traditions and their desires? She's extremely articulate on that, I must say, and she's got a lot of people who, for whom that resonates.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that. Anything else you want to leave us with as we wrap up? What's kind of the last punch?
Well, I don't want to come off too pessimistic about Japanese Catholicism, because we talked about the hierarchy. You could do that in any country. You start looking at the hierarchy and you get really disillusioned. One of the things that I find most interesting about not only Catholicism, but just religion in Japan, is that the Japanese are not atheists. Somebody once said, I think some wag said, to be an atheist, you first have to be a Christian. Most atheists were monotheists, at least. The Japanese don't really hate God. They don't hate Christianity. Their attitude is really remarkable. And it's something that G.K. Chesterton actually defined when he was talking not about Japan, but about paganism generally. And I think he really pins it, hits it right on the nose. And that is this: the Japanese, like all pagans, do not have a problem with not believing. They have a problem with believing too much, right? They believe in everything. So the Japanese, everywhere they go, there's a sense of spirituality. Even the dang Marxists pray before they eat, because everybody in Japan before they eat says, itadakimasu, and then they eat. And itadakimasu means I receive. It's a prayer, even if they don't know it. So that's one of the things that you have to go to Japan to experience. I encourage everybody to go to Japan because it's the last place where paganism is still alive. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, they have more faith in some ways than we do. They just need to have it directed. There's not many countries you can go to that are materially wealthy and yet really have a sense of the divine all around them. And that contrast makes Japan endlessly fascinating.
Well, I was in my trip to Japan a few years ago. I remember being struck at a woman. I was in Kyoto, and a woman coming from Tokyo telling me that we were on the train, and she said she was on her way to a major shrine in the city for her quarterly pilgrimage. So obviously shocking there to see kind of that level of commitment to come in and pray at a specific place on such a regular basis.
She sounds very unusual. I mean, those are the people who will come to Kyoto. So if you are a true believer in Buddhism or in Shintoism, especially Buddhism, because there's Buddhist temples everywhere, they'll make a pilgrimage to Kyoto like some people make a pilgrimage to, say, Rome. But most Japanese people will go there just because it's a really cool place to see cultural things. But she sounds like a very remarkable person.
And of course, preserved, I think, from bombing in the war, right? So having relative greater historical insight as well.
Yeah, no, they have old buildings, right, back to 700 AD because it wasn't bombed in the war. Most of them only go back to 1500 or so. Still, yeah, beautiful place. So I'd like to get your thoughts on Japan from your experience there.
Well, I started learning Japanese about 4 years ago, simply because my wife and I were going to go there. We had a graduation to go to in Singapore, and we thought, oh, Japan's in the neighborhood, right? Let's go to Japan after the graduation in Singapore. So we spent 8 to 10 days there, and I just loved it enough to say I really want to keep up these studies. So my morning commute, I'll do a little kanji, read a little bit and try to advance a little day by day. So just looking to fill out my knowledge by talking to folks like yourself.
Well, just keep in mind how many great saints have gone down that path, not just Francis Xavier, but also Maximilian Kolbe.
Right, right.
Spent 6 years studying the language. And by the way, a lot of people don't realize this, but there's new research suggesting that Francis Xavier was quite fluent in the language. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was a Basque, because we have a modern Basque missionary who went to Japan, and we know this, gave a fluent lecture for an hour 1 year after studying the language. And people said, this is impossible. How could you do it? And he said, I came here and I started recognizing a lot of these words sound familiar. The grammar's very similar. So because Francis Xavier was a Basque, I'm willing to argue that he probably did get pretty good, at least in the conversation of the language when he was there. So many saints have gone down that path.
Very interesting. So is that, I know Basque is considered a language isolate. Is there some sort of theory that there's a connection with Japanese, or do they just coincidentally happen to be similar languages?
Some people think it belongs to the Ural-Altaic language family. That's highly controversial. I don't know. The linguists don't know. I think it's more interesting to talk to a Basque person who's fluent in Japanese who says, yeah, this language is very much like my native tongue. That's pretty good evidence, I think. Yeah.
Very
But at any rate, Basque or not, there's a lot of saints who've studied this language, at least two very important ones, and I think a few more as well.
Yes, and Kolbe, it sounds like, looks like there's some good books out there on Maximilian Kolbe's, time in Japan, and including, I think, the novel you just mentioned that you translated, right, by
Yes. Sono Aiko, the woman I was talking about earlier. Yeah, called Miracles. And yeah, that's a very interesting book because she's a great novelist. The other one is published by a Franciscan member of the group that Kolbe started, Friar Ozaki. And it's called Father Kolbe in Nagasaki. It was just published in this country by the Academy of the Immaculate. It's an amazing book. I highly recommend it because it's not only based on primary sources and secondary sources around Kolbe's life there, but it's got a whole bunch of extremely rare photographs of Kolbe, his circle, the people around him, that really brings to life what the 1930s in Nagasaki was like.
And this isn't something we got to in our discussion, but it sounds like literature is a big area of Catholic involvement.
Oh, absolutely. It has been. I don't know if we can keep it going. A lot of people know about Endo Shusaku, or Shusaku Endo, as they would call him. Silence, Samurai is his better work. But this other woman, Sono Aiko, she's still alive, and she's a leading Catholic novelist who's written a ton of stuff. Now we have 3 of her works in translation. There's several other authors. There's so many Catholic writers in post-war Japan that I teach a course at Georgetown on short stories in Japanese, and all the authors are Catholic, not just Christian, but Catholic, right? So there've been a ton of Christian and Catholic and Protestant writers, particularly in the post-war period.
What do you attribute that to? Kind of such a high proportion?
It's hard to say. One could claim that as Japan became more involved in economic growth in the 1950s and 60s, people of faith were less inclined to go after the money, and they were searching for truth, and that made them a writer and made them reflective. I don't know. In other cases, well, Sono Ayako, for example, went to a Catholic university, the same one the Empress went to, Sacred Heart. And I think she got the bug there to write literature and was taught literature there. Endo Shusaku was harder to explain. He didn't go to Catholic university, but he did go to university where he studied French literature, which was in many ways a leading into Catholicism in Japan. It's really hard to explain, but I think people who write are reflective. At least they used to be. I mean, we're facing a double whammy. Catholicism is not growing in Japan. I don't think it's really declining, but it's not growing. And at the same time, literature is declining. Not just Christian, all literature. People have gone into manga, anime, and all kinds of other pop culture and internet stuff. So we may be witnessing the end of an era.
Interesting. Well, I'll admit my exposure to Japanese literature is limited. Like I suspect many Americans, I had a period as a teenager of really loving Haruki Murakami's work.
Yeah.
And the thing I just remember there is obviously there's the fantastic and surreal element in mundane daily life that pervades his work, but also a sense of emptiness, I think, and longing as well, that maybe perhaps the Catholic authors there's a bit more orientation about what they believe ultimately about things.
Right. I think you put it very well with Murakami Haruki. He really captures what I call the pagan mindset. The pagan consciousness is one of spirits and divinity all around, but at the same time, an unsatisfied thirst for something and not really sure what it is, right? So if you recall, St. Paul had to tell them what it was.
Yeah, yeah.
I know the God that you're looking for. And when you look at the Catholic writers in Japan, the best of them, Sono Ayako and Endo Shusaku, they don't write didactic stuff. I mean, they do write about the reality of faith as a struggle. And Sono herself finally gets to the point where she says, I can finally admit to you publicly, I'm not a good Catholic. Now, I don't want to take that too literally. She's not saying she's a bad Catholic, but what she's saying is I don't have to keep up the image anymore in front of my non-Christian co-nationals. I can admit that I'm a sinner. And it's very powerful, very poignant. And, I highly recommend Endo Shusaku. Other than Silence, almost everything else by him I recommend. I'm not a big fan of Silence, mainly because people misinterpret it. And also, Sono Ayako's 3 novels, the other 2 that were translated earlier, are just wonderful, sensitive, new.
Sorry, it looks like we froze up there for a minute, but you were telling me about her novels are very worthwhile, it sounds like.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was just saying I think they're very nuanced and powerful, and I highly recommend them.
Excellent. Well, I've got my reading list now.
I can't help it. I'm a professor. I'm always handing out homework.
So listen, thanks so much. Good luck now. I know it's the start of the semester, and hope classes and all are going well. And thanks so much for coming on and teaching us a little bit.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Same.
I hope you continue your studies in Japanese.
Yes, thank you. I'll do my best. Thanks so much.
Okay, you bet. Okay.